Hi guys, Andy N, Spoken Label, back in the house on a bank holiday Monday evening. I've had one of those days today. Been over to watch my local non-league football team, and I got drenched. It was a crap match, but it was great fun to see my friend Kevin. And to make top it all, I've got a dear friend of Spoken Label with me today. The wonderful Yvonne Reddick. Now, I first met Yvonne. We just talked about it just under 3 years ago, didn't we, as well? On Spoken
Yeah,
Label,
that's
and
right.
it's gone incredibly quick because when I bring people back on Spoken Label, say second, third, or even whatever times, I always look back at the previous podcast. I couldn't believe it. We spoke 3 years ago, man. That's gone so quick.
It feels like yesterday, doesn't it?
It does. I think it's time we're both getting old, really, to be honest with you. So,
Probably, yeah.
yeah, I know you've been over Salvey Bridge today, haven't you, as well? So you were just telling me
That's right.
before. So, you planting trees around there, did you say?
Yeah, I was planting trees and shrubs to make a hedge. So it
Oh,
was great fun. I had a brilliant day. I was on this really, really nice farm up near a clough,
oh yeah.
and the owners rescue sheep and horses and rabbits. So I met all these wonderful animals. I met some really nice people, and
Oh,
I
wow.
must have put in, I think I put in 30 or 40 hedge plants. I hope I did anyway. But it was brilliant. We started the day with just these field edges that had some kind of stones and rocks in them and were fairly bare. And we ended up with full-on hedges. So it was really lovely, actually. It was a great event.
Oh yeah, it's a great. I think we get bank holiday ones like we do. It's an extra one. I'm always a believer going to do something a bit unusual, whatever you're doing that, and it sounds like you've had a great day with that. Now, obviously, to sidetrack what we're here for today. Now, obviously, like people that don't know you, we better state you're not a farmer before we start, have we? Really? So that's why. But even though I can imagine knowing you and your family would be great at that. So tell us, obviously,
Well, thank
very
you.
briefly about yourself, first of all, then, obviously, as people that give you an introduction.
I publish poetry and nature writing. I'm also a researcher. So something I found out about not so long ago is that the poet Seamus Heaney actually sold bog poems to raise funds for a bog conservation charity.
Oh,
I thought
whoa.
there was, yeah, I thought there was a lovely resonance to that, linking an actual bog poem to practical bog conservation. He was also a great opponent of motorways
Oh,
in
yeah.
ecologically or historically sensitive places, Heaney. So he's even more of a hero of mine now, because I now know he supported conservation causes as well as libraries and museums and charities and all sorts of good causes. So that's one of the things I do for the day job.
Brilliant. Now, obviously, make people aware, obviously, but that kind of sums up perfectly what we're moving on to now. So, obviously, you've done a number like chapbooks before, but we're going to talk today really about your. I didn't realise this actually. Your debut full-length poetry collection, Burning Season, which come out just come out. Obviously, this is recording just before it, but it's coming. This is coming out after your book's coming out in end of May. Burning Season. Now, tell us first of all, because this is perfect, because obviously, like, the book itself is a fascinating book. But tell us first of all, then, about where the book came from, then. Because when we spoke originally back in 2020, I know you'd bought out your last chapbook, hadn't you? Spikenard, the year before that. So tell us about Burning Season, then. Why Burning Season to start with?
Yeah, well, it's the culmination of a lot of work. It's been quite a long road for me publishing my debut collection. I wouldn't have it any other way, though, because I think I've had the time to pick out the poems that were best, that worked best together. And it's taken a while to put together. I think one of the few things that kept me sane during lockdown was stacking up all the poems that I had that I thought might have a place in a book and shuffling through them and trying to put them in order. And there's quite an interesting lockdown story to this. My flat that I used to rent in the middle of Manchester had this internal mezzanine floor that nobody used for anything.
Oh,
And
yeah.
sometimes I'd go out and I'd sit on it with my computer and I'd do my work. And I used to lay out all the poems on the floor and look at them, and I'd put fire, these are the poems that are more earthy or rocky, and I group them according to elements. then I thought I'll see if I can group them according to a story. So I think there are a couple of stories in Burning a Season, really. There's the story of my father's life, his pretty untimely death, and the process of grieving for him, and also thinking about how different generations approach issues like fossil fuels and energy and climate change. So my dad was at my dad's career took place during the height of the North Sea oil boom. As a young lad, when he was doing his training as a petroleum engineer, he'd be out on the North Sea platforms. He then had some fairly long postings abroad. He lived in Oman with my mum. And when I was a child, I also lived in Kuwait City. So there was this sense that oil was this amazing source of energy. It was seen in those days as even cleaner than coal. And in my generation, there's been a bit more of a day of reckoning, really. There's an awareness that fossil fuels cause climate change. They're also one of many reasons behind major international conflicts. I mean,
That's true.
What the oil price does during a war such as the war with Ukraine is really quite interesting, and energy prices have gone up during this last winter, haven't they? But the oil conflict that has fascinated me ever since I went to the Middle East is the first Gulf War. Now, oil and exceeding production quotas was the trigger for the first Gulf War. This was a reason for the conflict. I didn't witness it in person. Everyone at school, all their parents had a Gulf War story. Loads of people I knew would discuss it. It was a huge, huge historical moment for people in Kuwait. I thought there weren't enough poems in English that were being written about it. I wanted to have a go, and I think in my poem In Oils, I hope it's clear that I'm working with memory, I'm working with fragments of an event that happened, even though I wasn't there to see it. What I did witness was Operation Desert Thunder, and I was evacuated during that. So at one point, Saddam Hussein refused to admit UN weapons inspectors into Iraq. And at that point, there were escalating concerns in Kuwait. A lot of people thought that Saddam Hussein had greater weapons capability than he had. They thought he had more weapons of mass destruction than they later found. And there were concerns that there would be another invasion. So my mother, my sister, and I were evacuated, not because any fighting actually occurred, but in the hope that if it did, we would be out of harm's way. And my dad had all these grand plans for trying to escape, because of course it's not seen as particularly great if if you're a working grown man and you just run away because there's something going on in the place where people have quite graciously let you come to work. So he had all these plans for, escaping to the border with Saudi Arabia through the desert. Would he have to ride around on a bike because he couldn't get in his car? All sorts of mad things, really, really crazy plans that my parents had. This is when, they were young and cool, and they did adventurous things. And frankly, it was an unsettling time for the whole family, I think, as well, and an unsettling time for people in the Middle East generally. So yeah, we had some adventures.
Yeah, it sounds like you did that now. Tell us a bit more about the oils then, because obviously we've just been talking about it as the poem. I loved that poem, it really did. And I loved the fragmented formula. You've doubly said it about memories, but if people see the poem, it's not just one memory, or even your memories or your parents' memories. There's all kinds of memories in that. It's a very sort of tapestry sort of piece, and I loved it. It's one of my favourite pieces in the book. So tell us about then how this piece came together then, because people read it, it's not a piece you definitely could have, should we say, knocked together over two or three glasses of wine. That's for sure with it. Oh, no,
Yeah,
I'll withdraw that comment. Not wine, cider in your case. People will go back to
cider.
previous podcasts. Well, no, you love your homemade cider. We'll come on to that in a bit.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, sure. Homemade cider is certainly a good shout. Yeah, it's got all sorts of fragments of different voices, really. I wanted to explore and find more out about the oil fires in Kuwait. These were a really, really huge environmental and political event. My dad and his colleagues would discuss them and tell me and my sister about them when we were children. So retreating Iraqi forces set the oil wells and oil infrastructure in Kuwait alight as they withdrew from Kuwait. And this was a pretty dramatic time. I've actually heard from Kuwaiti students of mine whose parents witnessed this, that you could not see the sun. The sun was as pale as the moon normally is in daylight. This is what people have told me long after I left Kuwait, and it's really quite an interesting image. And yeah, I heard from another student of mine who'd come over to study in Britain from Kuwait that the smell of the oil was overwhelming, and you could also smell dead sea creatures because it caused all sorts of destruction to marine life. So I watched documentaries about how the oil fires were put out. It took pretty specialist skills, including the skills of the reservoir engineer, brilliant woman, who was my father's manager. Also, some specialists in oil fires from Canada came along, and their testimonials of not being able to see daylight properly were really quite harrowing. I was also really struck by some footage of birds who had settled on the lakes of released oil, and they would drink it and go to bathe in it.
Whoa.
I know that image really stuck with me. It's incredibly disturbing. I was interested in what journalists and eyewitnesses experienced in Iraq as well. So I sampled all sorts of things that I had overheard, testimonials, an Amnesty International report, an interview with an American photographer who took a very, very famous photo of a burnt Iraqi soldier who'd been trying to escape from his vehicle. A journalist in Iraq who remembered the conflict, and I felt as though I was making a tapestry. And actually, I think memories work in a similar way. Really, you might have a selection of fragments, and you think, okay, what actually happened? Have I remembered that accurately? I don't feel that I have much of a right to write about international conflict myself, so I was quite careful to pick sources, and in the back of the book I acknowledge all of them.
Yeah, it's worth noticing in the back of the book there's 2 pages of acknowledgements, so people are wondering, which shows basically what thought's gone into this book. Dead true.
Yeah, it's a different method from the method I would normally use, piecing together quotations. It's a little bit more modernist than it is, my usual mode, which is more lyrical.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, I enjoyed making it. It felt like a poem that had probably been waiting for me to try to put it together for a long time.
Definitely. That. It felt like it was not just any sort of poem. It was a important stepping stone for you. I think a lot of this book is really for you, because I think it's people wonder, obviously, we've got the politics side of the oil there, but a lot of the rest of the book is about your relationship with your father, for example, which is in particular, one of my favourite pieces was the first piece in the book, Muirburn, which people are wondering, you can find an earlier version of it online, which I think is on the Poetry Society website. So tell us about next time. What made you want to start the book off with this piece?
Ted Hughes said something like, there will be a poem that appears early in a poet's career, which is a compact index of everything to follow. So apparently there's a keystone poem that you write quite early on, and it forms a pattern of things that will recur later. Muirburn was one of those poems for me. I think, you know, there may well be several that we produce in our lives that encapsulate all sorts of themes that are important to us. I was thinking about moorland fires and forest fires when I wrote that poem. When wildfires arrive in rainy Britain, you know that there's a shift occurring, and this is quite an unsettling thing to be witnessing. I have seen the impacts of climate change escalating as I have grown older. So heat waves are intensifying, droughts are becoming worse, the winters are becoming very unpredictable, and what dry conditions bring will be an increase in fires. So that link between fire and oil, fire and climate change, and fire and my father's career is one that I think is running as a thread throughout the book. That poem is an elegy for my dad. It was written a few years ago, and I think you can probably tell that it is a poem of grief. And I think in the background of it is this concern about climate change and this worry that even during my childhood, I would see fire beaters up in Scotland by a loch. And the fire beaters were there so that if you saw a fire occurring, if you know somebody had dropped a cigarette butt and it had smoldered and it had caught, you could actually go and you could have a go at putting it out yourself. You know, that would be considered an emergency during a drought. And I think that poem gives a sense of a lot of the work that was to come. It's not explicitly about the oil industry, but I think the link between oil fires and moorland fires is probably there in my book, really. So it starts off with this rather tender and poignant act of simply picking up somebody's ashes with a view to scattering them. And it continues in a vein that's probably more metaphorical and imaginary than anything else. You know, thinking of many members of your family who you have lost, as haunting the poem and haunting the book, I guess is the way I would think about it. And I did have an earlier version of it actually, and I listed a load of the chemicals and the minerals and the metals that are found in human bodies, often as trace elements. So there'll be all sorts of things, including, you know, there'll be radioactive isotopes in my teeth, which is quite an unsettling thought. And therefore, from fallout from nuclear testing, all sorts of weird things that you would not expect a person to contain, apparently we do contain in trace elements. And I intercut a lot of my more lyrical lines with the names of chemicals and metals that you would find in a human body. And I was lucky, the poem was picked up in the National Poetry Competition and it was commended. The judges read it out and they said those lines slowed the thing down. So in the published version, I pulled them out. And to be honest, I might use them again for something else, because actually it's quite interesting to think of what, you know, I as a living person contain and what traces there might end up being in you know, somebody's ashes. It's both unsettling and quite yeah, quite personal and ecological, I think.
I agree with you completely. I know it's a great piece and it's a great way of starting the collection indeed. Now, another thing that came up on the book, and I know we talked about this last time actually as well, so this is my memory, not been bad today, was I know your significance been influenced by Sylvia Plath's work as well. And it was great to see a Sylvia Plath reference pop up on top of Esther in the Asylum Garden. Now, tell us a bit more about this piece and what made you want to use that quote by Sylvia Plath at the top of the poem.
I'd reread The Bell Jar. I taught it to my students a few years ago, actually. I'm always struck by Plath as a nature poet. I think there are really interesting ecological strains in her work. And she read Rachel Carson. She read Silent Spring. I always thought it would have been a bit early for her, too early for her to have read Silent Spring, but apparently she read it when it was serialized in the New Yorker. So I see her as somebody very preoccupied with the environment. I think, like many people during lockdown, I had some moments of thinking, the world has gone mad. I have gone mad in it. What Plath writes about mental health and the methods of treatment that people had in the late 50s and the early 60s really, really struck me and stayed with me, as I think they do many people who are interested in literature. And I wrote that poem as an attempt to sort of cling to some semblance of sanity while we were going through the pandemic.
God, yeah.
And I think those images of confinement and being stuck in a medical establishment are probably some kind of slant way of approaching how weird it was to be stuck indoors.
Yeah,
when
one easy.
Just sort of raging around us. And if you were capable of going out even into a garden or a park during lockdown, it was the most wonderful thing ever.
Oh, so, God, yeah. God, yeah.
It was wonderful, wasn't it? It was great.
Yeah, I was locked up for 6 months because I know we told you last time we spoke, I'm diabetic. It was like that pointed question. They sent me home from my day job, said, I remember this, telling me, ring us up once a week to let us know you're still alive and we'll keep paying you. But it was like, I couldn't leave the flat. It was absolutely like, it drove me crazy. I was like, when eventually I could get out, I had to put a mask on. It was like, you just didn't know what was going on. Did you have anything? It was just incredible times.
It was so strange. Yeah, I mean, even looking out of a window and seeing a tree if you could not go outdoors, clinging to any semblance of a normality was really important. And there are layers and layers and layers and layers of references to Plath in that poem. I suppose it's quite a complicated one, really. And also I was very, very interested in the slightly weird life cycle of figs and the wasps that live in collaboration, in symbiosis with figs. They actually go into the fruit. It's so strange. And I knew Plath had written so beautifully and so movingly about bees, and I knew if I wrote a bee poem, it would be a cliche poem. So I had to write a wasps in figs poem, just to be a little bit different.
Best way. In some ways, a lot of ways, I wish you were still alive. I'd love to get her on the podcast now and talk about, obviously, every other stuff. But alas, it's not meant to be that one. So unless we can find a way of bringing people back from the dead, and that's not an impossibility now in society nowadays.
Well, I mean, she was a great user of the Ouija board with Hughes, so there's our method, hey?
Yeah, definitely with that one. But then I said we are bringing back extinct animals for DNA, so let's bring that poets to a DNA, extinct DNA, definitely. Anyway, I'm going to move on because I'm going to say what causes controversy here. Now, there's a couple of things I want to touch on this book, obviously. So I don't want to I want to give you time for reading, obviously, some pieces for us in the second half. But tell us about what made you want to use some extracts of journals in your book here. For example, your piece in November and December and January.
This is one of the other plot lines that I think goes through the book. So some of the things that I did also to try to stop myself going completely mad during lockdown was I planted some acorns. I had a lot of fun growing them. It was honestly like being a small child again, watching them grow. So lovely. And they were my connection to nature when I couldn't go to the places I really wanted to go to experience the hills and the forests and the valleys and the plants. And I became terribly worried about the health of these acorns. It was quite funny. I remember when we had all the regulations relaxed a little bit, and I was able to go away. And I'd always fret that they were going to die on me if I went off on holiday. You know, when you were able to go a few places in Britain, but you couldn't really go abroad. And I thought, well, there are a couple of different time processes that go along in the book and that occur. One is a grieving process, so gradually gaining distance from the event of my father's death, thinking it through and trying to sort of set it into some kind of order in my mind, because experiences like that can feel a little bit chaotic. Another is growing the acorns, and actually with the end of one life comes the beginning of this really quite weird and unexpected connection with a bunch of trees. And there's another poem called Fire Seed in that collection, which is about both pulling up a load of birches that I don't know if you know Crompton, they're older, but yeah, anyway, it's got this fantastic, love it, and they plant the tree species they want, and they pull out all the other species that they don't want. And I remember both seeing it regenerating after quite a big fire, serious fire. And I remember being asked to help out pull up, absolutely nonsensical. It felt really destructive pulling up the birch trees, but yeah, we replaced them with other things. So I was interested in growth to counterbalance the process of death and grieving that also goes on in that book.
Brilliant. Now, people wondering on the video, I've had to disconnect the headphones now because the sound went for a few seconds then. So, no, but I agree. Fascinating stuff indeed, that one, Yvonne. Now, there's a lot more I could talk about this book. I want to touch on, I think it's the longest piece in the book, actually, the conclusion, actually, Waterland, to wrap up with here, because this was like something I never thought I'd see of you, where, you know, obviously you and your way, you went into like sci-fi territory this last book, last piece. So I'll be intrigued to see if your next collection is not a sci-fi novel after the detail you put into Waterland.
Well, yeah, I mean, I wonder if I would produce anything that would be even readable if I tried a dystopian novel, Andy. I don't know. But yeah, anyway, with the fire, I suppose there comes water and there comes the flood. I must have watched Waterworld on the plane back from Kuwait when
it felt like you'd been seeing a Kevin Costner film there. And that's one of the worst films I've ever sat through.
It's terrible. It's terrible, but I remember being 10 and watching it on the plane, and I think something in it has stuck in my mind. But yeah, I can remember. I lived in Cambridge for a few years. How I didn't go mad with the flatness of the place, I do not know, but I loved it. I loved the waterways, and I used to love walking down by the river. I used to like spotting plants and animals. And I remember I went back, actually, there was a really old willow tree, and it had this huge crop of mushrooms growing on it. And the university had put a big sign saying, "We are studying this fungus. Please do not touch it, collect it, remove it, or disturb it." And I thought, only in a university town. It was hilarious. And I was aware that my dad had this joke. Just to be mean, he'd always go, give it 100 years. Cambridge is going to be underwater. It's going to be completely underwater. And I think that those memories were probably working somewhere deep in my mind. And in my poem, Waterland, Cambridge is underwater. The North Sea comes back, having been drained out of a lot of East Anglia, and people who live there just have to cope with it. So all sorts of weird things happen in my poem. Like, I thought, well, you know, what would it be like if you just had to adapt and get on with life? You'd put the books in a boat and you could have a floating library. Could you seal some of the buildings and have them kind of going about their business as usual underwater? People would have to take to boats if they wanted to go somewhere else. It's a very strange poem. It's interesting that you see it as a sci-fi sort of poem. I think I see it
Me
that
just
way.
tormenting you there, but there is that sort of futuristic element behind it.
Yeah, I think there is. I think it's a dystopian poem, certainly. But I'm also doing that weird modernist thing where I'm sampling voices as well.
Oh, yes.
So I thought it needed to be a poem that had lots of characters in it. And I can remember rebelliously sitting in my bed at university when I was supposed to be finishing an essay about Shakespeare. I think it was an essay about tragedy, and I confess I was really bored. And I read Under Milkwood by Dylan Thomas, and I loved the idea of a many-voiced sort of radio play. So I think that was somewhere on my inner ear when I wrote that poem too. It's a climate change poem, really, but I suppose it's a playful one, and it's one about survival as well, and trying to adapt and make the best of things, even though they're really, really odd.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's fantastic. I think it's a great way of finishing the book off as well. It's like it's just opened the possibilities up to all kinds of things. You know, it's a great way to finish it off. Now, before we get on to, I always like to ask people what plans they have next. People that know us too from last time will know we went in quite an in-depth discussion of homemade cider. So I have got to ask you, how is that going? Have you had any more good homemade cider recently?
Not very recently. Yeah, at uni, my friends and I used to make homebrew cider. This was very entertaining. There was an orchard outside our accommodation, and we used to juice the apples. They got strained through my mate's t-shirt into an old bin. And we just put the lid on and left it there, and this bizarre concoction came out, thoroughly fermented and really strong a few weeks later. That stuff would knock out a horse. You know, you used to dare your friends to drink a pint of it. Anyway, it was it did the job. It got you really drunk. My mate has been making sloe gin. This is my mate John, who lives in New Mills, and actually that's probably the best homebrewed fruit-based concoction that I've been sampling. It's very, very good. And it's entertaining, actually. My mate John and my other mate John, actually, one lives in New Mills, the other lives in Marple, and in Marple apparently there is the mother lode of sloe bushes, and John from New Mills goes straying into other John from Marple's territory and goes pinching the sloes, and it's just incredible. It's magical, that sloe gin.
Since the last time I spoke to you, and it has been mentioned on the podcast as well, me and Amanda went on a home and went in, she won for us a competition just before lockdown, actually, where you had to go into a gin distilling factory in Manchester, and we were in there all day. Just past last time I spoke to you, this was actually absolutely insane. It was like we came back with our own basically full bottle of gin, and it helped us get through lockdown. That's a sure of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hangovers I had after mine. I kept making mine too strong. Was ridiculous. But it's got to be done anyway. We'll better move on now, because I know me and you were like after last time. People would check. That was probably the longest podcast I've done. Right? They kind of said it all. Really, we went off the 20-minute tangents about home brewing. So, but obviously, Yvonne, I know you've got a number of readings coming up, haven't you? Some of which are coming after this podcast comes out, and some before. So, give us a list of what you got coming up and reading wise.
Sure, I've got a few nice things happening. So on the 26th of May, I'm going to be appearing at the London Review of Books bookshop alongside my mate, Patrick Davidson Roberts, our friend Catherine Lockton, and our friend Declan Ryan. So I'm really excited about that. There's loads going on the 29th of June. I am appearing at the UCLan Festival of the Humanities at the University of Central Lancashire in Preston. On the 2nd of July, I am going to be doing a writing workshop at Burnley Words, and then a bit later in the year, I have a nice reading in Bolton, and then one in Berwick. On the 12th of August, I'm going to an art gallery, and Maria Isakova Bennett has invited me to do that alongside her friend, the photographer Ron Davies. And what we're going to be talking about actually is we've done a collaborative piece looking at the Iron Men sculptures, the Anthony Gormley Another Place sculptures on the coast near Formby. So we're also going to be reading poems, and I'll be reading from my book Burning Season 2. So there's loads going on. My diary suddenly got very, very full after being a bit empty for a while.
They always say sleep is optional, don't you? So definitely with that one. So do you have any envisions of where your poetry is going to go next then? Do you have any ideas or?
Yeah, I've become obsessed with Peak District poems, and I know why. I mean, it's, you know, it's where I go roaming around walking every single weekend. So my mate Lindsay and I have been chatting about this actually. I'm writing a long sequence of Peak District poems about walking and also climbing, or at least attempting to climb. There's a lot of falling off in both my life and in my poems, and yeah, touch wood, it's been a lot more comical than consequential. Yeah, I'm writing a big sequence of mountain poems, so I'll wait to see what happens with that, and yeah, how it ends up all hanging together, if it ever does.
Well, hopefully your side of book may follow some point in the future as well. Then definitely.
Oh yeah, I hope so.
Okay. If people obviously want to get hold of your new book, Yvonne, where do you recommend they go? Let's start wrapping up.
The best place is the Blood Axe Books website. You can find the book there, and also their events page will have a list of all the readings I'm popping up at.
Brilliant. And if people want to find out more about you, Yvonne, where do you recommend they go?
My website is yvonnereddick.org. Also, you know, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter. I like interacting with people there, and I get a lot of my poetry news from Twitter and Instagram, to be honest. So yeah, they're good places to connect.
Brilliant. That sounds good to me. What we'll do, we'll wrap up here, and we should be back in a few minutes when Yvonne's going to read out a few pieces from the book. Look forward to this. See you all in 2 minutes.